Right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another edition of Power Parsha. Today, we're going to be talking about Parshat Vayeira. Vayeira, which means, and he appeared. And the Torah portion opens, the first scene of this week's Torah portion is God appearing to Abraham on the third day after his circumcision. And God finds Abraham sitting outside his tent. It was a very hot day because Abraham should have really been in bed recovering from his circumcision. And so not to burden him, God made it very hot. And like that, nobody would be coming because Abraham and his wife Sarah operated a bed and breakfast and would always be hosting guests and people. And to keep him off his feet and to keep him from running around, God made it a very extra hot day so that people wouldn't be coming by. He'd have nothing to do but lay in bed and recover. But as it turns out, Abraham just couldn't lay still. He needed to be kind. That's what his thing was. And so he was outside of his tent actively looking for guests. And that's where we find him talking to God. And God notices that while he's talking to Abraham, Abraham is, sort of looking over God's shoulder to see if he can see anybody in the distance, maybe somewhere behind that great light. Maybe somebody's come, maybe somebody needs a hand. And so God realizes that he's not going to be able to keep Abraham down. And so he sends him 3 guests. And Abraham excuses himself from his conversation with God. And when he sees those people on the horizon, he runs towards them and brings them in and takes care of them. And so we know that Abraham is a very kind person. We know that Abraham runs a bed and breakfast, the Vayita Eshel, that he has this space where he is hosting people, inviting people and taking care of people, feeding them and taking care of them. And we know from this specific episode how, to what extent Abraham went to host people and take care of guests. So we learn a lot about inviting guests, the mitzvah, the commandment of hachnasat orchim and hosting guests. We learn a lot about that from this description here in this story, in the opening of this week's Torah portion. In fact, we learn that hosting guests, taking care of people, is even greater than hosting God, because Abraham interrupts a conversation with God to go tend to these wanderers, these travelers that had come his way. And so this is the primary source we find this discussion about Abraham taking care of his guests. Now, what's interesting is what Abraham didn't know was that these guests weren't people. Abraham thought that they were these travelers and idolaters who were just traveling through, but in reality they were angels that came in the appearance of human beings, and Abraham took care of them. In fact, Abraham is preparing a feast for them. He's preparing meals, and he's putting them in the shade, and he's washing their hands and their feet, taking care of all these things. And angels, though, don't eat. And so the angels just appeared to eat. They pretended to eat, but really, when he wasn't looking, there's stuffing the sandwiches under their tunics. But the point is that Abraham didn't actually host guests in this story, and that's kind of ironic, right? That we learn about Abraham hosting guests from guests who weren't even guests, and he wasn't actually hosting them. We learn about the importance of feeding visitors and passersby from Abraham, who thought he was feeding them but didn't. But what's interesting is that what we learn from this story is the importance of your desire, your intention. Abraham intended to take care of his guests. His desire was to care for them, and that's what counts. That was primary. Certainly in the times of Abraham, before the Torah is given, everything was happening more in a spiritual sense, every mitzvah. But even here, specifically the mitzvah of inviting guests and hosting people and taking care of people, part of the actual care is the intention, the love, and commitment which you bring to that act, right? We know, I think studies have shown that people who provide service with a smile usually get tipped better than people who provide service without a smile. Right? People enjoy when you're being taken care of with a smile, with compassion, with warmth, with enthusiasm. That's something that is very impactful. So Abraham here, what we read from this story, we understand from the story is the will and intent of Abraham in taking care of his guests. In fact, that's all there was in this actual episode. Now that's the opening of this week's Torah portion. If you go to the end of this week's Torah portion, and 15 minutes allotted for Power Parsha is not enough to get into the story, but we're just going to reference the closing act of this week's Torah portion, which is the Akedah, the binding of Isaac. And here too we find something interesting, which is that Abraham what matters here, this is the 10th of all of the 10 tests that God tests Abraham with to see his devotion and commitment to God. And it's the most difficult and challenging, the hardest of all the tests, which Abraham ultimately passes with flying colors. And what was the test? To see if Abraham was prepared to sacrifice his son. And here too, we find that there was never a situation where God wanted him to actually sacrifice his son. Right? God was testing Abraham. It was just a test to see if he would be willing to do it, but not that God actually wanted him to do it and then maybe changes his mind in the last minute. So there was never a situation where Isaac's life was in danger in this story. It was merely a test to see what Abraham's desire is, what his will is. Is he willing to do God's will, to fulfill God's will? And here too, we find that Abraham was willing. We learn from this the idea of alacrity when performing a mitzvah, a commandment, that you do it with alacrity. We learn this from Abraham waking up early in the morning to go get on his way, to go take care of what had to be, to go do what had to be done. In other words, he was enthusiastic, he was passionate, he was doing it with great devotion and with great sincerity and desire. What's interesting is that in the story, when we find that Abraham takes Isaac and binds him on the altar, so it says that Abraham had to take the knife. He had to take the knife. So the commentaries seize on that and say, what does it mean that he had to take that? Obviously, he's gonna do what he had to do. So, but what is this idea that Abraham takes the knife? It was like a separate act of taking the knife. And so they explain that Abraham had trained his body. Abraham was, we know in general, to get a little mystical for a second, the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Rachel, one of our matriarchs, are regarded as the four wheels of the divine chariot. Which basically means that they were vehicles and vessels through which God's will was done, with no independent interest and ulterior motives of their own. So these were people that were completely in sync and in line with God's will. So Abraham had trained his body to do God's bidding. Whatever God wanted, his body did it naturally. But here, with the Akedah, with the binding of Isaac, God didn't want him to sacrifice his son. And so Abraham gets up there, and his body is not moving towards doing what he thought he had to do. And that's because in reality, God didn't want him to do it. Nevertheless, we see Abraham's desire to fulfill God's will, that Abraham and his intention that he brings to it, that he deliberately takes his arm to go, extends his arm to go take the knife and to carry out that act. The point of these two stories, bookending this week's Torah portion, and you can find a similar pattern in through the other narratives as well, is the importance of intention, the importance of doing something with intention and commitment and devotion. So it's not about just going through the motions. Obviously, now the main thing is always the act. The main thing is, if you're not feeling particularly kind and generous and interested in hosting somebody, you should still take care of them. You should still feed them. You should still shelter them. If that's what's required, that's obviously primary and the most important thing. But at the same time, we have to bring our own will, our own intention into it. We have to align our will and desire, bring that passion into the act, and that transforms the act. It makes the act a whole different act. So we learn from Abraham to live life with intention, with meaning, with purpose, and to bring that devotion, that intention into everything we do. This is something that we observe today. The Jewish world that's galvanized and mobilized to do and to commit, and people doing things that they normally wouldn't find themselves doing, and doing things that might even be difficult and challenging, but doing them with such enthusiasm, with such excitement, with such passion, with such devotion, because again, we have this ingrained within us from our first father, our forefather Abraham, who taught us, showed us the way how to fulfill God's will and how to do the right thing and do it enthusiastically, do it passionately, and do it with meaning and sincerity and beauty. And with that, wish you all a wonderful day.